Several years before the John Benet Ramsey case, America was trying to solve the mystery of the disappearance of 7-year-old Jaclyn Dowaliby. Was she abducted by a stranger who entered her home under the cover of night? Or did she become a victim within her own family? The police were convinced that the culprits were always in plain sight, whereas no one who knew the family doubted their complete innocence. Midlothian, located in the state of Illinois, USA, is a small town where everyone knows each other. It is situated approximately 30 minutes south of the bustling streets of Chicago and is considered a quiet suburb where there is always a sense of being in a familiar place. However, in 1988, the town changed forever when 7-year-old Jaclyn Dowaliby disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Jacqueline lived in a cozy, ranch-style home with her parents, David and Cynthia, and her 4-year-old brother, Davy. The family resided in a beautiful location, surrounded by several nature preserves, all within walking distance from their home. Jacqueline's biological father, Jimmy Guess, had no involvement in her life after a bitter divorce from Cynthia shortly after their daughter was born. David Dowaliby adopted Jacqueline when he married Cynthia 5 years ago when Jacqueline was 2 years old, and he was the only father she knew. Cynthia worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, and David was a carpenter who had been promoted to a foreman. David and Jacqueline had an instant connection, often going fishing and bowling together. According to one neighbor whose daughter was friends with Jacqueline, she was a happy little girl who never showed any signs of sadness or anger. According to all accounts, the Dowalibys were a typical, close-knit suburban family. On the evening of September 10, 1988, Cynthia took Jacqueline and Davy to a nearby KFC Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant, while David met up with his friends and went bowling. When all family members returned home, they watched television, and Jacqueline, wearing her favorite purple and white pajamas, kissed Cynthia and David goodnight. What exactly happened in the house that night remains unclear, but the next morning, the little brunette with brown eyes was no longer there. David and his son woke up earlier than the other family members on the next morning, and around 7:45, David noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought that his mother, who lived with the family, had left it open and didn't worry much about it. He prepared breakfast for Davy and turned on the television. A little later, Cynthia woke up and went to wake up their daughter but couldn't find Jacqueline in her bedroom. The parents called Jacqueline's friends, thinking that she might have gone outside to play. While they searched for the child inside the house and in the neighborhood, Cynthia noticed that the basement window was broken and wide open. David immediately called the police and reported his daughter's disappearance. After investigators arrived at the house, Cynthia and David explained that none of them had heard anything unusual during the night, and they had all been sound asleep. Nothing was missing from the house except Jacqueline's blanket, which matched the colors of her pajamas. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle. Investigators needed to determine whether someone had broken into the house and taken Jacqueline, or if she had left the house herself, only to be taken by someone else. Although there were no phone calls or ransom notes, the FBI agents took over the investigation, presuming that they were dealing with a kidnapping rather than a runaway case. Soon, the news of a possible abduction spread throughout the town. The suburb mainly consisted of families with young children, and the possibility that someone had broken into a family's home and abducted their little girl in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep was a horrifying revelation. Considering that there were no signs of a struggle, investigators began to wonder if the girl might have left with someone she knew. If the intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window, they needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to enter the girl's room without waking the other family members, investigators concluded. We are looking at it with an open mind as a potential abduction, but also as an abduction with someone known to the family, said Police Captain John Bitton. This statement led Cynthia to recall an unsettling incident that occurred several years earlier. After a bitter custody battle during which her former partner, Jimmy Guess, did everything in his power to keep their daughter with him, he had broken into their home and attempted to take their daughter. Therefore, Cynthia suspected his involvement in Jacqueline's disappearance because she knew he was capable of such actions. Jacqueline's grandmother, Ann Dowaliby, admits that she wasn't initially worried about her granddaughter's safety because she believed that Jacqueline had been taken by her biological father, and she was confident they would quickly get her back. However, she couldn't have known that Jimmy had been in prison in Florida for the previous 4 months during Jacqueline's disappearance and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Suspicion also fell on Jacqueline's uncle, Timothy Guest, who lived nearby and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, he had an alibi. It was at this point that Cynthia began to worry that something bad had happened to her daughter. The parents of the girl, Cynthia and David, were questioned multiple times in the following days. They didn't hide anything. They explained that Jacqueline had gone to bed at 10 p.m., and when Cynthia went to check on her at 11 p.m., she was sound asleep. The police became increasingly skeptical of the parents' story. It was difficult for them to believe that a person unfamiliar with the layout of the house could have crawled through the basement window without disturbing the towel dryer right beneath the window. Then, they would have had to walk down the hallway to the girl's room and take her away without waking any of the other family members. The only sign that a stranger had been in the house was the broken window. No fingerprints or signs of a struggle were found. Indeed, when it comes to fingerprints and other evidence, it's important to note that the police themselves made a series of mistakes that could have influenced their conclusions. They never secured the girl's room to prevent anyone from entering it, and they didn't thoroughly search the house. A forensic expert took photographs, but he didn't even bother to take close-up pictures of the broken window. He checked the window and the front door for fingerprints, but not the back door. What was even more astonishing was that the police allowed friends of the family to clean up their house and even sweep away the glass from the broken window. The police just stood by and watched as they cleaned up, destroying any evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. Immediately after the girl's disappearance, Jacqueline's parents were asked to take a polygraph test. Cynthia was too distraught for such a test. Friends recall that she was in a terrible state, constantly feeling nauseous. David underwent the polygraph test, which he passed. But in the minds of the police, everything seemed to point to the parents. The number of potential suspects sharply narrowed after one of the forensic experts stated that, in his opinion, the basement window had been broken from the inside. On September 14th, 5 days after the girl's disappearance, the parents attempted to take a polygraph test again. Cynthia's results were inconclusive due to her emotional state. David's results were also inconclusive, and the polygraph examiner accused him of not cooperating with the investigation. David in turn claimed that the polygraph examiner instructed him to answer yes to all questions, including the question, "Did you kill your daughter?" to which David refused to answer yes. Afterward, David was taken into an interrogation room and was not released for 5 hours. Later that evening, Michael Chapman pulled into the parking lot of the Islander Apartments on 1912 Canal Street in Blue Island, a town located about 5 kilometers from the girl's home. When Chapman exited his car, he noticed an unpleasant odor in the fresh autumn air. He spotted something wrapped up in the grass, which he described as a wrapped-up object. As he approached, he saw a head and a hand, and he immediately ran inside to call the police. Jacqueline's body was discovered, and she was still bound with a 2-meter rope, which was considered evidence of the crime. Her soiled underwear was found about 60 centimeters from her body. As for the police, they continued to question Jacqueline's father for about 1.5 hours without informing him that his daughter had been found. They tried to convince him to confess to the crime. When Officer Kevin Shaughnessy finally told him about Jacqueline's discovery, David didn't believe him, thinking it was another police trick to make him confess. This is likely why he responded with the phrase, "I guess you think I should cry now?" However, Officer Shaughnessy interpreted these words differently, and they convinced him not to pursue other suspects. In any case, there was no evidence against David, and he was released to go home, where he found his distraught wife and realized that his daughter was truly gone. By morning, with the help of dental records, the body was officially identified as Jaclyn Dowaliby. Initially, based solely on the appearance of the body, there was speculation that she had been struck on the head, but the Cook County coroner, Dr. Robert Stein, stated that the condition of the body was the result of rapid decomposition due to the unusually warm September weather. Dr. Stein could not determine with certainty whether the girl had been sexually assaulted or not due to the state of decomposition. Although the exact time of death couldn't be determined either, Robert Stein concluded that she had been dead for several days, and the terrible crime was most likely committed early Saturday morning, right after her disappearance. After the body was identified, and given that they had been individually questioned for hours before Jacqueline was found, both Cynthia and David hired lawyers who advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any more questions from investigators. They had already told the police everything they knew, provided blood and urine samples, and gave permission for investigators to examine any family medical records that might be relevant. They also allowed investigators access to their home for all 5 days that Jacqueline was missing. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution allows citizens to refuse to answer any questions that may incriminate them. The Dowalibys had every right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. However, with no other suspects, law enforcement focused their attention on Cynthia and David as the primary suspects and claimed that it was suspicious that they were not cooperating with investigators. Police rushed to accuse the family of refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Prosecutor Patrick O'Brien explained, "Even if you are being looked at as a suspect, and you know deep down inside that you didn't do this, and it's unfair, the idea of not cooperating with the police that are investigating the murder of your daughter seems overly concerned about your personal interests." On the day after the funeral, a team of 20 police officers executed search warrants at the Dowaliby home. They emerged from the house with several large bags containing items they wanted to examine in the laboratory. Additionally, they confiscated the family's blue Chevrolet Malibu. Months passed, but there were no updates or new information about the case. However, the police made a statement indicating that the family members had not been excluded as suspects. Cynthia's lawyer, Lawrence Hyman, criticized the police investigation, calling it a blatant violation of the law. While Cynthia and David continued to avoid communicating with the media, they had a multitude of supporters. Neighbors stood by the family, telling journalists that the Dowalibys were a loving and caring family, and they had never heard either of the parents raise their voice at Jacqueline or Davy. David's boss, Ross Patterson, recalled, "The only time David took a day off work was when he needed to get documents for Jacqueline's adoption. However, this did not convince the investigators. Adhering to the theory that Cynthia and David could be involved in the crime, they returned to the location where the body was found and began showing photos of Cynthia, David, and their car to residents of the Islander apartments, hoping to find any witnesses who might have seen them in the area. On November 22nd, Cynthia and David were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their son Davy was placed under the care of the Department of Family and Children's Services. It became known that a tenant of the apartment complex where the body was found had told investigators that he had seen David in a blue Chevy Malibu in the parking lot. A witness, a 35-year-old city transportation worker named Everett Mann, said that around 2 a.m. on September 10th, he was pulling into the parking lot, and his headlights illuminated a blue Chevy with a driver he claimed was David Dowaliby. During Cynthia and David's arrest, they were deliberately paraded in front of the media so that as many photos as possible could be taken, seemingly to convey the message, "Look, we've done our job." Detectives boasted about having a wealth of evidence against David and Cynthia, including 2 witnesses. However, it remained unclear why loving parents would act this way towards their daughter. Were there enough pieces of evidence? Or were the investigators rushing to take the case to court for some reason? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the fact that on the same day as the parents' arrest, a major news story emerged. Richard M. Daley, the state's chief prosecutor whose office was handling the case, announced his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Critics accused him of using a high-profile crime in his political game. But despite the criticism, Daley became the mayor of Chicago, and the case was handed over to the court. It is widely known that eyewitness testimonies are highly unreliable. Nevertheless, the witness statements suggesting that David was near the crime scene were enough to charge him and his wife with first-degree murder. Blue Island Police Chief Paul Greaves referred to these witness testimonies as excellent evidence that allowed them to rule out other leads. The police never disclosed what those other leads were, but relying solely on witness testimony to exclude all other possibilities seemed somewhat prejudicial, especially considering that Cynthia was not linked to the crime scene. Both spouses were denied bail, and it was revealed that Cynthia was in the early stages of pregnancy. In the search for new evidence, the police decided to focus on the couple's 5-year-old son, Davy, who was examined by a doctor. Supposedly, the doctor found traces on his body that could have resulted from a belt, some of which were old while others were recent. The police suspected that Cynthia and David had abused Davy at home, suggesting it could be a motive for the crime. Patrick Murphy, Davy's state-appointed guardian, said that the police and prosecutors continuously questioned the child for days. He added that after speaking with Davy and reviewing his medical records, He couldn't understand how they arrived at such a conclusion because he couldn't find anything that indicated violence against the child. He also mentioned that Davy constantly pleaded to see his parents, and he missed them greatly. In mid-December, Cynthia and David were released on bail, but Davy was not allowed to return home with his parents. He was placed in the custody of David's sister Rose and her husband John. Davy was only allowed to see his parents during supervised visits. In April 1990, the court proceedings began. It became clear early on that the evidence gathered by law enforcement was not as compelling as initially reported. The prosecutors didn't even have a clear motive for the crime, but fortunately for them, they were not legally obligated to provide one. Their main argument was straightforward. There were no outsiders in the house, so the Dowalibys must be guilty. The defense argued that due to the poor police work, it was impossible to determine how the intruder had entered the house and what had transpired inside during that night. The idea that the intruder needed to know the layout of the house to find Jacqueline's bedroom seemed far-fetched. The family lived in a typical ranch-style house. Many such houses are built with a similar layout. Anyone who had ever been inside a similar house would likely know the layout. The prosecutors also tried to argue that the intruder had to navigate through a window without disturbing objects below, such as a vanity, a TV stand, and a towel rack. To demonstrate that this was possible, David filmed a video showing how a neighbor climbed through the basement window, propped his leg on the wall, and didn't disturb any objects below. Furthermore, it turned out that the prosecution had only one witness, not two. Everett Mann, the key prosecution witness, admitted during the trial that he had identified David solely by his prominent nose. He was about 70 meters away from the man in the parking lot and only remembered his distinctive nose, as it was dark and the lighting was quite dim. Moreover, during the photo identification, Everett was shown a frontal picture of David, while he had only seen the person in profile. Additionally, David's photo was much larger than the 4 photos of other men. Everett admitted that the person he saw that night could have been African American or Caucasian, or even a man or a woman, and all he saw was a silhouette that only looked male. In a night without moonlight, 3 weeks into the trial, the jury members were taken to the same parking lot where Everett had supposedly seen David. They stood in the same spot under similar conditions as Everett. They could hardly see anything. In reality, they couldn't even notice a nearby garbage can, which was said to be near where the car was parked. Several neighbors of the Dowalibys also contradicted the witness's account regarding the car. The defense lawyers built their case around the fact that a remarkably similar crime occurred in the same neighborhood about a year after Jacqueline's abduction. On September 2, 1989, Perry Hernandez broke into a home in Blue Island and kidnapped a 6-year-old girl while her family slept. He entered by breaking a window and made his way inside without waking anyone. The man took the girl to a railroad bridge near the Calumet River, tormented her, and then allowed her to return home. This happened within 1.5 miles of where Jacqueline was found. An interesting detail emerged. The girl Hernandez was living with at the time also owned a Chevy Malibu, and Perry often stayed overnight at her apartment. In fact, even on the night before Jacqueline's disappearance, someone had entered another home in Midlothian. Elizabeth Siki woke up in the middle of the night and thwarted an attempted robbery or abduction of her daughter. She identified the person she saw in her home that night as Perry Hernandez and expressed confidence that he intended to abduct her 7-year-old daughter, whom she found tightly wrapped in 3 towels, as if someone had intended to take her away. While this may seem like more than a coincidence, Judge Richard Neville stated that he did not consider this evidence and prohibited Cynthia and David's defense from presenting these facts in court. However, the little girl abducted by Perry Hernandez was invited to testify. She recalled that while she was with the kidnapper under the bridge, he held a rope, as if threatening her with it. Besides the striking similarities between the 2 cases, this demonstrated that a small child could indeed be taken from a bedroom without waking anyone. However, in court, the defense made a mistake by failing to establish a connection with the jury members. They wanted David to take the witness stand and firmly declare his innocence, looking them in the eye, but that didn't happen. The most significant obstacle for the defense turned out to be the 17 autopsy photographs and remains presented to the jury. The prosecutors claimed that the photos were meant to help determine the time and cause of death. The defense believed that these photos simply contributed to bias among the jury members. An attorney explains, "You're shown a beautiful girl next to a photograph of her body, and of course the jury members thought someone must pay for this crime. However, the photos didn't convince the judge, who dropped the charges against Cynthia because her only connection to the crime was being in the house. The judge ordered to keep his decision secret because David's fate still lay in the hands of the jury due to the testimony of Everett Mann. After 14 hours, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty. Everyone believed that David would be acquitted, and the media were already waiting for him outside the courthouse for interviews. It was a shock to everyone that he was found guilty. The judge sentenced David to 45 years in prison. Many didn't understand why the jury had no doubts about his guilt, but suddenly everything fell into place. In an interview with a reporter, the jury foreperson confessed why a guilty verdict was reached. It turns out that the jury saw photographs of the Dowaliby home. In one photo, the bedroom door of young Davy showed a dent from a fist, and the jurors believed this indicated David Dowaliby's violent nature. Coming to this conclusion, the jury members decided that there had been a lot of violence in the house. How wrong they were. The fist-sized dent had appeared long before David moved into the house with Cynthia, and perhaps even before Jacqueline's birth. David's younger brother had struck the door with his fist when he was a teenager. The house belonged to David's mother, and the family always had more important things to spend money on, and the door was never replaced. Neither the defense nor the prosecution mentioned this dent, so the jury's decision was based on things that were not even discussed in court. The jury foreperson added that if they had their way, they would have accused Cynthia as well. During this time, Cynthia fought for custody of Davy. Several psychologists and social workers testified, stating that there was no hint that Davy had ever been mistreated, and Cynthia was a kind and loving mother who doted on Davy, and he on her. By mid-July, Davy was allowed to return home to his mother and his recently born sister, Carly Marie. The fact that the jury was biased against David needed to be used to challenge the verdict. Cynthia and the family's friends formed a committee to fight for David's release. One committee member offered a $10,000 reward for any information about the crime. Additionally, the committee allowed them to connect with people who could assist with the case. One of those people turned out to be Robert Byman, an attorney from the Chicago law firm Jenner and Block, who volunteered to work on the case pro bono. Initially, due to police statements, he also believed in David's guilt, but after studying the case materials, he realized there was no evidence against him at all. He understood that David was wrongly accused due to human nature. Byman explained, 12 good and decent members of the jury were entrusted with deciding the fate of this case. Their choice was simple: to stand up and leave, saying, "Sorry, Jacqueline, we can't do anything for you," or to convict the only person sitting before them. They chose the latter. In October, Robert Byman filed a petition for David's release based on new evidence. Gerald Bauman, a prisoner at Cook County Jail, claimed that he had overheard Perry Hernandez confess to the murder. However, after the petition was filed, Gerald refused to sign his previously given sworn statements, fearing for his safety, and claimed that he had received threats after news of this new evidence came to light. The appeal garnered such a significant response that, for the first time, the Illinois Appellate Court allowed video recording of the case proceedings. The Illinois Appellate Court had three options: uphold the guilty verdict, order a new trial, or completely exonerate David, which would mean he could never be tried for this case again. 5 months later, the court's decision was announced. Complete exoneration. The court ruled that the chief witness's testimony had been inaccurate and unreliable, and the prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David was the only person with the opportunity to commit the crime. The judges noted that all the basement windows had been left unlocked that night, and any of them could have allowed the perpetrator inside, but unfortunately they were not checked for fingerprints. They also criticized the decision to show the jury 17 gruesome body photographs that were unnecessary. On November 13, 1991, after spending 18 months in prison, David walked free. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years, and in all that time, there have only been 3 times when I was as happy as I was the day I walked David Dowaliby out of prison. Our judicial system is designed to work in 95% of cases. This time the system failed. It convicted an innocent man, said Robert Byman. However, The Dowaliby family was about to experience yet another shocking turn of events in one of the most paradoxical and unusual murder sagas in modern Chicago history. It became known that Rob Warden and David Protess, who were writing a book about the case titled Gone in the Night, had discovered a new potential suspect. Timothy Guess was a 31-year-old brother of Jacqueline's biological father. Timothy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a house with his mother not far from Jacqueline's home. Initially, he claimed to have been working at the Park Avenue restaurant in Harvey on the night of the murder, and 3 restaurant employees confirmed his alibi. However, now 2 of them had recanted their statements. At least 5 regulars of the establishment also claimed that Timothy wasn't there that night. Warden and Protess spoke to Timothy, who told them that he often heard voices in his head and suffered from memory lapses. He told them that he was guided by a spirit, and this spirit had allowed him to describe the layout of the Dowaliby house, even though he had never been inside. He could even describe how to get to Jacqueline's bedroom. Timothy described the blanket in which the body was wrapped, and somehow knew that the light in the bedroom was off on the night of her disappearance. However, Timothy was never seriously considered a suspect even after this information came to light. He passed away in 2002. Protest said, "I felt that the case was solved, but I never thought anyone would be held accountable for the crime. The state would be too embarrassed to admit they had wrongly accused Cynthia and David." Since then, the Dowaliby family has moved and changed their last name due to the excessive attention on their lives. They still hope that Jacqueline's murder will be solved. Something terrible happened in that ranch-style home in Midlothian, Illinois, on the night of September 9, 1988. But 3 decades later, there are still no answers as to what exactly transpired. While the local police claim the case is open, there are evidently no leads being pursued. Every U.S. citizen has the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but when Cynthia and David exercised that right, they found themselves at the center of a wrongly and negligently conducted investigation. In 1994, in the small town of New Haven in the state of New York, 18-year-old Heidi Allen was abducted from the store where she worked. 2 brothers were accused of her kidnapping, but 2 separate trials led to paradoxical outcomes. All charges were dropped against one brother, while the other was found guilty. However, if you thought, well, at least they caught the guy who did it, by the end of this story, you'll likely change your opinion. On April 3, 1994, Easter Sunday, 18-year-old Heidi Allen began her shift at the convenience store attached to the D&W gas station in New Haven, a town in Oswego County, New York. Heidi was a determined and energetic young woman with ambitions of building a career in education or psychological counseling. Devoting much of her time to sports, her tall and robust build made her an invaluable member of volleyball and other teams. Despite her athletic prowess, she maintained a friendly demeanor, and everyone noted her warmth and responsiveness. Heidi had been working at D&W for over 2 years. It was her day off, but she agreed to cover a shift so that her colleague could spend the day with her children. Heidi's shift began at 5:45, and she arrived at work with her boyfriend. This was not unusual, as he often accompanied her to ensure she felt safe while opening the store very early in the morning. Typically, he would wait until the first customers arrived and then go about his day. That's exactly how it played out on April 3rd. Another customer entered the store but didn't see any staff. It might have seemed like the store was closed, but the gas pumps were operational and the lights were on inside. The customer went outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. Sheriff's deputies entered the store, finding everything seemingly in order. There was money in the cash register, and $9.50 was on the counter, left by another customer as payment for fuel and a newspaper. There were no signs of struggle or apparent issues. A security alarm was located under the counter, but it hadn't triggered that day. The officers discovered Heidi's car parked on the street, and her purse and car keys were still in the store. Despite the absence of signs of a struggle, the sheriff's deputies concluded that she might have been abducted, and the search for her began immediately. The state police offered assistance to the sheriff's office in Oswego County with the search for the missing girl. They had the resources to block all exits and ensure the abductor wouldn't escape. However, the sheriff inexplicably declined the offer, stating that his team could handle it on their own. Officers checked the punched receipts at the store's cash register and discovered that the last purchase was made at 7:42 when someone bought 2 packs of cigarettes. It was crucial to find this customer, as they were the last person to see the girl at work. Fortunately, the search for this individual didn't take much time, As soon as the news of Heidi's presumed abduction spread through the town, a man named Richard Thibodeau called the police. He claimed to be the one who was in the store that morning. The girl sold him cigarettes, and he left afterward. When extensive searches for the girl began, local residents, including Richard Thibodeau, his brother Gary, and his wife Teresa, joined in. Around the same time, Christopher Bivens contacted the police, describing how he drove past the store and saw two men leading a tall young woman toward a van. He thought one of the men was holding the woman tightly. He admitted he didn't remember the appearance of the van or the men, but noted that they were quite tall. Despite Richard Thibodeau voluntarily contacting the police and assisting in the search for the girl, law enforcement grew suspicious of him due to the timing of his purchase, just minutes before the concerned customer approached the sheriff's deputies. Additionally, he drove a van similar to the one described by Christopher. The police searched Richard's van, but nothing connecting the vehicle or its owner to Heidi was found. Richard willingly provided his fingerprints, blood samples, and hair without objection. Due to suspicions surrounding Richard, investigators turned a closer eye to his brother, Gary Thibodeau. After all, Christopher Bivens saw two men taking the young woman out of the store. Gary explained to detectives that he was still sleeping at home that early morning, and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. A month later, the police charged Richard Thibodeau with the abduction. Gary was also taken into custody, albeit for a different minor offense unrelated to Heidi's disappearance. While he was in jail, law enforcement managed to build a case against the brothers. Suddenly, two inmates emerged, claiming that Gary had said Heidi was no more and she would never be found. Thus, detectives arrested a man who had voluntarily called the police and reported being in the store that morning. Despite no evidence against him, Richard willingly provided all the necessary samples and underwent a polygraph test. However, it seemed to have little significance. Richard and his brother Gary, a person with an alibi, were charged with first-degree kidnapping. A jury trial was conducted separately for Gary Thibodeau. During the trial, no concrete evidence or forensic testimony was presented, and Heidi was still missing. However, the prosecution was confident in their case. They called a witness who had seen two men with a girl near the store that morning, and jury members heard the statements of two inmates regarding Gary's alleged remarks about Heidi. Although the information provided by the two convicted individuals contradicted not only each other, but also established facts at that time, they were allowed to testify in court. The jurors heard that Heidi disappeared within just 13 minutes between the last recorded cigarette sale and the arrival of sheriff's deputies at the store. During these 13 minutes, the witness saw two men leading the young woman to a car. He described the vehicle as a white van with two dark blue or black doors at the back and two doors of the same color on the right side, along with a wide 6-inch black stripe above the wheels. The same witness, Christopher Bivens, identified the van as the one driven by Richard. However, it's crucial to note the interesting evolution in the testimony of this key prosecution witness. Initially, he could hardly recall anything about the men or the van where Heidi was supposedly placed. Suddenly, he could remember minute details, and the height of the men decreased to match the Thibodeau brothers' heights. Another customer from the store was called to testify. He made a purchase at 7:41, just a minute before Richard bought 2 packs of cigarettes. The man explained that there was a running van in the parking lot, and he assumed it was Richard's. He saw Richard in the store and, for some reason, believed there were 2 men in the van. Essentially, his testimony merely confirmed that Richard Thibodeau was in the store, a fact that Richard did not deny. A 13-year-old girl also provided testimony, claiming to have seen Richard's van parked at Gary's house shortly after Heidi Allen's disappearance. The girl insisted she remembered this because it was Easter Sunday. She had just woken up and looked out the window to see the van. However, after the trial, she recanted her statements, admitting that it could have been a dream. This constituted the evidence presented by the sheriff's deputies. The prosecutors had no concrete evidence linking the Thibodeau brothers to the abduction, no motive for the crime, and no logical explanation for why Richard Thibodeau would buy cigarettes if he intended to abduct the girl. Why not simply pocket the cigarettes when he and his brother allegedly took Heidi out of the store? Despite all this, Gary Thibodeau was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. During Richard's trial, nearly all the same evidence was presented, except for the testimony of the 2 inmates. However, since a different judge presided over the case, and there were different jurors, The outcome of the trial turned out to be entirely different. All charges against Richard were dropped. Richard returned to his family, while Gary began serving his sentence in prison. Gradually, the case of Heidi Allen's abduction began to fade from memory until an unexpected turn occurred in February 2013. A woman named Tanya Priest called the police, claiming she needed to unburden her conscience. She recounted a conversation that took place in 2006 when she gave a ride to her friend Victoria West to the trailer home where she lived with her boyfriend James Steen. The couple invited her inside, and as they chatted about random topics, a news segment about Heidi aired on TV. The girls started discussing what might have happened to her when James suddenly said, "Do you really want to know?" and began his story. It was the last thing the girls expected to hear. Steen revealed that he, along with two friends, Roger Breckenridge and Michael Borer, had abducted Heidi that day, taking her out of the store and putting her into Michael Borer's van. Borer was waiting in the van, meaning that two men took the girl out of the store, just as witness Christopher Bivens had claimed. The men then drove Heidi to the trailer home of Breckenridge's girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott, on Rice Road in the town of Mexico, Oswego County. Steen added that they had long gotten rid of that van, but the body could still be found in a shed in the woods across from where the trailer had been located. When asked why they had committed such a grave act, Steen explained that Heidi was planning to report to the police their involvement in illegal drug trafficking. At first, the friends didn't believe Steen, thinking he wouldn't harm a fly. However, a few years later, when Steen killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, who happened to be his cousin, out of jealousy, Tanya Priest was no longer sure that Steen was so harmless. Interestingly, the police initially hesitated to believe Tanya Priest's words, but she was determined not to give up, and the officers eventually yielded to her persistent requests to investigate this version. They assisted Tanya in secretly recording a phone conversation with Roger Breckenridge's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott. In the phone conversation, Westcott admitted knowing about what happened to Heidi Allen and went so far as to say that the men didn't bring the abducted girl into her trailer, but left her in the van. However, when sheriff's deputies questioned Jennifer and presented her with the recording, she evaded and claimed she just wanted to quickly end the conversation with Tanya, agreeing with everything she said. During a polygraph test, she lied about knowing who abducted Heidi Allen. Despite this information, law enforcement did not actively pursue the case. At this point, Tanya reached out to Gary Thibodeau's lawyer because by then, she was convinced of his innocence and wanted to help him secure his release. It's worth noting that the main problem in this case has always been the motive behind the crime. It's entirely unclear why the Thibodeau brothers would kidnap a girl they barely knew. Similarly, the motive for three men to take such a heavy burden upon themselves remains unclear. However, it turns out that such a motive could exist, and law enforcement authorities did not want the truth to come to light. Heidi Allen, an 18-year-old employee at the gas station convenience store, had been a police informant for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl got into trouble when she was caught by the police during a party her sister wanted to attend. As she was a minor and had put a child who was with her in the car in a dangerous situation, Heidi faced significant problems. In exchange for dropping all charges, the 15-year-old girl made a deal and became a police informant. Although she was a confidential informant, her status was revealed by a bizarre accident. Before she disappeared, Heidi worked with a sheriff's assistant, Chris Van Patten, who accidentally dropped her informant card with a photo and the codename Julia Roberts near the store where she worked. The card was found by Heidi's colleague, Kristen Duell, who returned it to the police. Kristen claimed that she only told her mother about it, but even if the girl told the truth, it is unknown how long the card lay on the ground and how many bystanders could see it. Inmates who testified in court against Gary Thibodeau claimed that Heidi was worried about Gary because he was planning to involve her in illegal dealings with controlled substances. However, firstly, one of these inmates later recanted his statement. Secondly, Heidi's diary was found where she detailed her life, and there was not a single mention of the Thibodeau brothers. Thirdly, the information that Heidi was, in fact, an informant allows for the dismissal of these baseless insinuations. The newly revealed information provided an alternative theory about Heidi's abduction, especially considering that her status was compromised, and dangerous people could have learned that she worked for the police. Considering the new details, in 2014, after persistent demands from Gary's lawyers, searches were conducted in 2 cabins in the woods. One was literally opposite the place where Jennifer Westcott lived. Search dogs indicated the potential presence of remains near the cabin. Police found fresh shoe tracks at the site, and inside it was evident that someone had already dismantled the floorboards. However, the forensic examination conducted by the Bureau of Forensic Services did not detect any human remains. It's interesting that when Tanya Priest decided to share what she knew, numerous witnesses from the town immediately came forward, claiming to have heard James Steen, Michael Borer, and Roger Breckenridge boasting about Heidi's abduction. Some of these witnesses asserted that they had reported this to the police on multiple occasions. Even the key prosecution witness, Christopher Bivens, stated that Steen and Breckenridge looked much more like the individuals leading the girl out of the store. However, as he had never seen their photos before, he considered the Tibbet brothers as possible abductors. Around the same time, it was revealed that in 2004, Heidi's cousin, Melissa Searles, found an envelope in her mailbox containing a gold bracelet she had once gifted to Heidi. The envelope had no postage stamp, indicating that it wasn't sent through the mail, but was personally placed in the mailbox. Melissa claimed that she had not reported this discovery to the police for years because the entire family believed Heidi's abductor was already in prison, and there was no need to reopen the case. However, with the new abduction theory, she apparently felt compelled to share this information. In 2015, the appeal process regarding Gary's accusation began. The defense insisted on a new trial due to a wealth of newly revealed information. 52 witnesses, including 3 considered potential new suspects, testified. A key witness was a woman who drove past the D&W store around 6 a.m. on April 3, 1994. She reported seeing an old, rust-covered van with no black stripe down the middle, confirming that it wasn't Richard Thibodeau's van. The defense tried to argue that the 3 men kidnapped the girl, forcing her into Michael Bohr's van, and took her to a cabin in the woods because they feared she would report them to the police. The men, of course, denied everything, but Michael Bohr slipped up by mentioning seeing Heidi's informant card near the store. Furthermore, Bohr told law enforcement that he wasn't a cruel person, so he couldn't have committed such a crime. However, this was untrue. Michael Bohr had previously been accused of kidnapping a young girl, making him, unlike the Thibodeau brothers, capable of such a crime. What's intriguing is that he was obsessed with this case, collecting a whole box of materials related to Heidi's abduction. One entry in his notes was particularly intriguing. He wrote as if a psychic told him that Heidi hid the bracelet behind the car seat. She added that Heidi hid an item where she was held, and all her family members would recognize it. Despite the abundance of new information, Gary lost the appeal after a year of hearings, and he was denied the opportunity for a new trial. From 2015 to 2018, subsequent judicial decisions also prohibited presenting new evidence due to doubts about the reliability of witnesses and the lack of sufficient proof to substantiate the alleged confessions of the 3 men. None of the 3, James Stein, Michael Bohr, or Roger Breckenridge, were charged in connection with Heidi's disappearance. Perhaps if Gary's lawyers had known about another crucial lead, they might have persuaded the judge to allow a new trial. The prosecutor informed the defense that he had provided them with all case materials. However, on December 13, 1994, he explicitly prohibited copying documents from a specific folder for the defense attorneys. Inside were 2 letters from the globally renowned expert in determining truthfulness, Murray Myron. His services were often sought by FBI agents, and he was asked to speak with a witness who might be the one who saw Heidi after her abduction. The expert concluded that Brent Moore's account of specific events related to Heidi was truthful and accurate. He did witness her being transported in a van, and she found refuge in a garage on the Barlow property in the town of Scriba. Brent was only 3 years old at the time of Heidi's abduction, and the expert was invited to verify whether the boy was telling the truth about the events of that day. The expert talked to the child, analyzed his drawings, and believed him. He advised looking for Heidi where the boy indicated. Interestingly, Brent knew Heidi before the abduction. His mother mentioned that during the Christmas holidays, after a visit to Richard Mitten, the boy's father, Brent mentioned seeing Heidi and that she gave money to Richard. When shown a photo of Heidi, the boy immediately recognized her and called her by name. Additionally, he accurately described her car. Brent added that 3 friends of his father were involved in Heidi's abduction, and the boy's mother remembered a conversation with her ex-husband on Easter Sunday in 1994, the day Heidi disappeared. She recalled how Richard suddenly claimed that 3 boys had kidnapped her. Who they were and whether they knew that Heidi was an informant is unknown. Investigators attempted to search the garage indicated by the boy, but couldn't conduct the search on either the garage or the adjacent area due to the lack of a warrant, and the homeowner did not allow the search. As evident, there are several theories about what might have happened to Heidi Allen besides the police's version implicating the Tibbetts brothers. It's possible that Stein, Breckenridge, and Bohr were the kidnappers, or perhaps friends of Brent Moore's father were involved. Since the girl was not found, there's also a more optimistic version suggesting that she entered a witness protection program. What if the police realized the danger they put Heidi in by making a teenager a confidential informant and then compromising her status? This could explain many unexplained aspects of the case. The appearance of her bracelet, the lack of signs of struggle in the store, the absence of evidence clearly pointing to any of the suspects. One might want to believe that she had to leave her family, but no one kidnapped her, and she is enjoying life somewhere in this world. Although one thing can be asserted almost certainly, when the sheriff's assistant dropped Heidi's informant card, he put an end to the life she had led until the age of 18. What truly happened on the morning of Sunday, April 3, 1994, remains unknown. It's possible that we may never find out. What we do know is that Gary maintained his innocence until his last breath. Gary Thibodeau passed away on August 12, 2018, at the age of 64, and his health did not allow him to live the additional 2 years to a potential conditional early release. Gary's departure means he will no longer have a chance to clear his name. Hope for another appeal in federal court died with him. He will remain a convicted inmate who abducted an 18-year-old girl and, according to many, is the second victim of this terrible and convoluted crime. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister, Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center, And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store, since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman getting into a van with a baby. They approached and explained the situation. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store, since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman. They decided to take it for analysis just in case. Rosgan got in touch with John Flowers to inform him that the police had visited his store. John was quite surprised that they hadn't found the girl yet, but readily answered all the questions. He explained that the bleach smell in the storeroom was because his dog used it as a toilet, and he had to clean up after it frequently. It was possible that's how a tiny drop of blood ended up there. As for the surveillance camera footage and the receipts for the book purchases, he would need to come to the store to look for them and hand them over to the police. Rosgan asked about the books Ginger bought, and this is where the surprise came in. One book was about creating a new identity, and the other was about contract killers. But why did Ginger buy these? Did she genuinely intend to disappear? Or did someone force her to buy these books and then kill her in one of the ways described in the second book? The tiny spot on the wall, possibly blued, turned out to be too small for analysis. Nevertheless, it wasn't very important since everyone already knew Ginger had been in the store and left. What was much more critical was figuring out where she went afterward. Indeed, there were several possible leads, especially considering Ginger's striking beauty and her public performances. Many people, including those with bad intentions, could have noticed her. Moreover, her father worked as a dealer in one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. When it comes to money, things can get messy. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding the girl alive was dwindling. The answer regarding Mark's car came, and guess what? They found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing at all. At this point, Rosgan thought of John Flowers. He considered the possibility of checking the surveillance camera footage to see if someone had approached Ginger at the store's exit. However, he was too late. Exclaiming, "Where have you been all this time, guys?" John explained that he had reviewed the footage, saw Ginger entering the store, choosing the books, paying in cash, and leaving. Since no one had come for the video, it had been overwritten with new footage from the surveillance camera. John also couldn't find the receipt for the books, although he was certain that it should be somewhere. After this, John seemed unwilling to cooperate further with the detective, partly because his business had suffered due to police, media, and curious onlookers who crowded his shop after Ginger's disappearance. Selling lockpicks and fake police badges in a store that was already filled with law enforcement paraphernalia was understandable, but it put immense pressure on his small business. Rosgan understood this, and there was nothing to push John into talking with them. The case was put on the back burner, and the police had no new leads. In fact, the truth was there, but the detectives working on Ginger's case wouldn't discover it until several more months passed. On May 5th, in the Mojave Desert, nearly 400 miles from Vegas, a group of hunters stumbled upon a shallow grave. The medical examiner determined that the body in the grave belonged to a young, dark-haired girl aged 15 to 18. She had no identification on her, but the killer hadn't taken her quite distinctive jewelry, a pink ring with 3 colored stones and another ring shaped like wire loops, intertwined to form the letter M or W. Could the M signify Mark? Or perhaps it was a family heirloom, because Ginger's mother's maiden name was Watersworth. Hoping for public assistance, the local police published photos of the jewelry, but it would be a very long time before they would learn the truth. In the meantime, to crack the case, the detectives needed a lead or a body. Suddenly, on August 16, 1997, Jeff Rosgen received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as a federal agent from Arizona and claimed to have a lead on the Ginger case. Rosgen was intrigued. The agent explained that John Flowers had been accused of selling illegal eavesdropping devices. But what did this have to do with Ginger? The agent continued. John had gone on the run because he didn't want to be arrested, but his wife, Cheryl Cizone, had been brought in for questioning. They were interested in her husband's whereabouts, but suddenly she started talking about Ginger Rios, who had disappeared in Vegas several months ago. The agent left the room to make a call to Rosgen. It was only now that Rosgen realized he had never formally questioned the owner of the spy shop, the last place Ginger was seen. And yet, Ginger's husband had mentioned that there was a man and a woman behind the counter. Rosgen asked the agents not to let Cheryl out of their sight and hurried to Arizona. Rosgen couldn't have anticipated what Cheryl's interrogation would reveal. When Ginger entered the shop to browse for books, John Flowers turned to Cheryl and asked her to go buy film. This wasn't unusual, as she often ran errands when they worked together at the store. Cheryl returned after about 10 minutes, and that's when Mark walked in. John told Mark that his wife had just left and couldn't have gone far. Mark thanked them and left. Cheryl's husband seemed like a different person. He had a terrified look on his face. She asked him what was going on, and the man replied, "I did something terrible. Whatever you do, don't go into the storage room." Cheryl had no idea what he meant, and it never occurred to her that her husband had harmed someone. However, his behavior unsettled her, and a little while later, she decided to check the storage room. Inside, she found the lifeless body of a young girl with a pool of blood surrounding her head. The carpet was also soaked in blood. The girl had been brutally beaten. It was the same girl who had entered the shop before John had sent Cheryl to get film. Cheryl felt disgusted, but her disgust quickly turned into fear when she realized John was right behind her. She hadn't even turned around when he grabbed her by the neck and ordered her never to speak about what had happened there, or something bad would happen to her as well as their child. Cheryl obeyed his command, but now that John was on the run, she decided to tell the truth. The detective wanted to know how John explained the situation to Cheryl. John told her that Ginger had a note from 2 of his former employees who were demanding money. Supposedly, the contents of the note and Ginger's insolence had infuriated John, and he had hit her so hard in the face that she fell back, hit her head, and died. However, Cheryl was convinced that this was a lie, and she had never seen the note. She did know for sure that John had taken garbage bags and spent several hours in the storage room, wrapping the girl's body in plastic bags and pouring bleach around her. He had told the employee that the dog had used the room as a restroom. Then, he put the body in his van and told Cheryl they needed to leave for Arizona immediately. That's when Ginger's father and husband approached them and pleaded for them to show the surveillance camera footage. John and Cheryl looked them in the eyes and lied, even though Ginger was lying just inches away from them. But that's not all. Cheryl also knew where her husband had buried the body. You see, they had gone to the Mojave Desert several times, John and Cheryl together. One time, John left Cheryl in the middle of nowhere and drove off with their baby and the girl's body. It's clear that he buried her, returned for Cheryl, and drove home. But this wasn't enough for him. They went to that location several more times so John could hide the shallow grave under a layer of concrete. It was only the last time that John came running back panicked and screaming, "They found her! They found her!" So Cheryl was quite certain that the police had already discovered Ginger's body. In any case, she agreed to show the detectives the location in exchange for no charges being filed against her. They accepted her offer because they didn't believe Cheryl had been involved in the murder. She led them to the spot. When they arrived in the desert, the local officers started connecting the dots between the body found by hunters in May and Cheryl's revelation. Cheryl asked them to stop the car and led them to the place her husband had visited. The police expected to find an empty grave, but instead, they reached a concrete slab that appeared untouched. There, they discovered the body wrapped in plastic bags. Thanks to a tattoo on the lower back, they had a preliminary identification as Ginger, but they decided to wait for DNA analysis before informing her family. This raised several unanswered questions. Were there two victims? Did John kill both? If so, why and who was the second girl? Now they could secure a search warrant for the Vegas store where they found traces of Ginger's blood. The DNA analysis later confirmed that the body in the desert also belonged to her. Mark, who had clung to the hope that his wife had simply left and started a new life, was devastated. He blamed himself, thinking he should have gone to the store with her. But how could he have imagined that a complete stranger, the owner of a popular and frequently visited store, would attack his wife, someone who was a mother and his loving spouse? John's attempt to hide didn't last long, and he was arrested at a hotel in Los Angeles. The extradition process began, during which the detectives discovered that there was no John Flowers, the owner of the spy store's chain. Instead, there was a 26-year-old Craig Jacobson wanted for crimes committed in Florida. From the age of 10, the boy had struggled with mental health issues, suffering from paranoia, borderline personality disorder, and likely antisocial personality disorder. He spent a year in a mental health clinic and then served 30 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. However, in 1995, he disappeared. In his place, John emerged. In addition to this revelation, the police found another potential victim of John or Craig. 2 months prior, a teenage girl had entered the Vegas store, but before she could even browse the merchandise, the owner approached her, slung her over his shoulder, and carried her into the storeroom without uttering a word. Her luck was incredible because another customer entered the store and scared John Flowers away, so he released her. This young woman didn't report the incident to the police out of fear, and her word against the word of a respected businessman could have been problematic. This, of course, was before the truth about John came to light. In the following months, psychiatrists examined him multiple times and deemed him unfit to stand trial. The prosecutor was convinced that Craig was faking it, but feared that the crime might go unpunished. He explained to Ginger's family that the best option would be to offer him a plea deal. Craig agreed to plead guilty to the murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison before he could be eligible for parole. As for the other girl, Craig mentioned her name as Mary Stoddard. She was the 18-year-old daughter of a chiropractor who had come to Vegas when he kidnapped and killed her. Ginger Rios' relatives hoped that he would be charged with Mary's murder, which could at least result in a life sentence or possibly even the death penalty. But here's the catch. Mary Stoddard, the daughter of a chiropractor as described by Craig, was alive and well. The body of the unidentified girl had already been reburied, but they had previously created a 3D model of what she might have looked like and obtained a DNA sample. This was all the police had, because as it unexpectedly turned out, the documents with information about her place of burial were lost, and no one knew in which grave she was located. In simpler terms, they had lost the body. Nevertheless, the police didn't give up on trying to identify who she was. In their list of missing persons, there were 300 people. Finally, on June 30th, 2010, after 13 years, they managed to identify the girl. More precisely, she turned out to be a teenage girl, as it was 15-year-old Christina Mary Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona. The girl lived in a group home, but constantly ran away from it because she was treated poorly there. She disappeared on May 3, 1997, while carrying a load of laundry to a self-service laundromat. Her path led her past the spy shop in Phoenix. Despite her difficult childhood, Christina had many people who loved her and were looking for her, including her friend Valerie, who never stopped searching for her. Valerie created various social media profiles in an attempt to draw attention to Christina's disappearance. Valerie would say, "No matter how long it takes, I will never stop thinking about her, and I won't give up. For me, she's not just a case number. I loved her. That's true love, never giving up on finding someone." Valerie couldn't have known that Christina was found just a week after her disappearance, in the desert, on her 16th birthday. As for the mystery of the girl's ring, the letter M on it signifies Martinez. Interestingly, the sister of the real Mary Stoddard mentioned that Craig had dated Mary when they were both younger. The guy was already behaving strangely back then, and if this is true, he could have become so fixated on Mary that after parting ways with her, he always sought women who resembled her to vent his anger. Considering that Mary is alive, but Craig called Christina Mary, it's possible that this was a fantasy he played out in his head while committing the crime, as many killers, especially serial killers, do. Most likely, Craig didn't plan his crimes but succumbed to impulsive acts, as was the case with the teenage girl from Vegas who survived because another customer scared the killer away. It's also possible that he targeted victims. As we know, Ginger had been to the store before her disappearance. Craig never revealed the reasons for his behavior, but investigators believe the murders aimed at violence against women because Ginger's underwear was found around her ankles. In any case, now, thanks to being charged with a second murder, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. It's remarkable that Craig was able to deceive so many people so easily. Mark and George, who were searching for Ginger, his own wife Cheryl, who had no inkling of his hidden nature, and even experienced Vegas police officers who had seen much in their careers. He truly appeared like an ordinary family man, and it makes you wonder where one can feel safe, if not with a store owner standing behind the counter with his wife and baby. Late spring of 1995. Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists where lovers go to enjoy the sunset, an ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and call for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there, with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world. declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to 125,000 euros. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received 475,000 euros. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports, and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. She pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statements she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel, and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, The task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man? The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive. The car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to Healthmark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests, but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service. In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23 and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schmidt was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, while hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand and couldn't hold onto her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios, between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car.
Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Vanber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned
why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to 115,000 euros. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, the young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Vanber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured, and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However, she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to 475,000 euros. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schlitt. The 2 reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Mark's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Mark were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Mark with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Mark never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Mark's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, but the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Mark's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 kilometers per hour. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. It is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all since, theoretically, he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Mark Vanber did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Mark suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, he died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail. Mark hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed 2 almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Vanber family would never have suspected her of anything. Carrie Swenson probably learned to ski before she could walk, but she could never have imagined that biathlon would become her life because for women, this sport simply didn't exist before. Finally, in 1983, women were allowed to compete in biathlon, despite many of them enduring years of rigorous training. The USA team missed the first Women's European Cup but participated in the first Women's World Championship in Chamonix, France. The 22-year-old American, Carrie Swenson, started with the traditional 10 kilometers race. She finished 5th right after the Soviet athletes who were considered unbeatable leaders in the sport. In the 5 kilometers sprint, she was the best among her teammates, securing the 13th position. However, the real triumph for the team and personally for Carrie came in the relay. The Americans took the 3rd place, and Carrie and her teammates became the first medalists from the USA. After the biathlon season ended, Carrie returned home to Montana, where she planned her perfect summer. she got a job at a popular tourist ranch called Lone Mountain Ranch and spent all her free time trail running in the backcountry. Carrie opened the window, letting the fresh night air fill her bedroom. This morning, she graduated from Montana State University, receiving her degree in microbiology. After the ceremony, her parents threw a party, celebrating both her graduation and her brother Paul's 21st birthday. They had only won last summer at the Lone Mountain Ranch in the Big Sky area to practice and enjoy the mountains as they did in their childhood. One more year of competitions, and then she would leave to study veterinary medicine, a dream she had since she was 5 years old. Carrie turned off the light in her room and happily drifted into sleep, unaware that her dreams would soon be shattered by the selfish plans of two recluses. Carrie had no idea about the conversation between the two men that took place in the mountains, several kilometers away from her. The younger man didn't hide his irritation. He generally enjoyed living away from people and their rules, but he felt lonely in the mountains and longed for female company. "Dad, do you remember the plans we discussed about getting ourselves a woman?" The father looked carefully at his 18-year-old son and asked, "Do you think the time has come?" In response, the son nodded confidently. On Sunday, July 15th, Carrie went for a run around Elray's Lake. She chose this route because Bob Sharp, the owner of the snack bar where she worked, had told her that he had seen a grizzly bear in the area, and she was eager to see it herself. As usual, Carrie ran fairly quickly, focusing on her breathing. Only at the last moment did she notice two men ahead of her. The strangers looked unkempt, they were not smiling, and the younger one had his hands on a pistol and a knife. Rifles were lying near a tree, even though the hunting season had long ended. Without taking their eyes off her, the men made Carrie realize that they had no good intentions. Unfortunately, she noticed them too late to turn around and run back. Fear triggered an adrenaline rush in her blood, and Carrie sprinted forward even faster, trying to pass the strangers as quickly as possible. However, her plan failed. The older man jumped right in front of her on the trail and grabbed her wrist. Not giving her a chance to react, he grabbed her other hand. Unable to break free from their grip, Carrie decided to rely on her wits and remain calm. The wild look in the older man's eyes frightened her. "Stay calm, don't provoke them," she thought. "Please, let me go," she said. "No, we don't come across pretty girls like you very often. We want to talk to you. What's your name?" he asked, holding Carrie even tighter. He began asking her various questions about whether she was married, who she lived with, and so on. Realizing that she wouldn't be released easily, Carrie tried to scream, but the man quickly silenced her. The stranger released her left hand, only to strike her in the face and then tie her up with a rope. The men said they would keep her with them for 4 or 5 days, and if she didn't like life in the mountains, they would let her go. However, from their smirks, she understood that they were more likely to take advantage of her vulnerability and eventually kill her. "It's just a nightmare," she repeated to herself, hoping to wake up at any moment, but the pulsating pain in her wrist and face indicated that it wasn't a dream. Carrie tried to appeal to their reason, explaining that her family and friends would look for her. In response, the older man threatened to shoot anyone who tried to rescue her. The men hurried on, wanting to move farther away from the lake and into the forest where they wouldn't be noticed. Carrie had no choice but to allow them to drag her along on the rope. Pretending to be submissive, she discreetly memorized the surrounding area to ensure she wouldn't run in the wrong direction when she got a chance to escape. The men walked side by side, chatting casually, as if kidnapping girls was an everyday occurrence for them. They discussed their views on society, laws, and the mountains. The older man expressed dissatisfaction with the region's development, particularly the fact that farmers were allowed to graze their livestock on his land. He told the younger man that he could learn everything necessary for life without returning to formal education or obeying society's laws. Such conversations made Carrie realize that her captors were likely mentally unstable. In an attempt to slow down their movement, Carrie asked for water and claimed she needed to rest. The men agreed to take a break. They approached a swamp, and to her horror, Carrie watched as the older man began drinking water from it. She tried to warn him about the dangerous bacteria present in the swamp, but he dismissed her concerns, saying it was the first time he'd heard of it. Reluctantly, she took a few sips as well. She noticed that the kidnappers behaved less aggressively when she pretended not to fear them. Carrie started cautiously questioning them about how long they've been living here without knowing about the dangers of drinking water from the local swamp. They replied that they were relatively new to the area but had been living in the mountains for 12 years. The younger man added with a smirk that they were desperately in need of female company, making Carrie feel even more uncomfortable. Afterward, they continued on their way. Carrie tried to step on soft ground and break twigs to leave clues for her family and friends who would search for her. Unfortunately, the older man noticed her efforts and thwarted them. Nevertheless, since she had nothing to lose, Carrie stubbornly kept leaving marks, and the older man kept erasing them. They continued this way, and when Carrie checked her watch, she realized that no one had started looking for her yet. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Carrie's friend and colleague, Alan Goldstein, who taught shooting to guests at the ranch, began to wonder why her run was taking so long. He was afraid that she might have encountered a bear or twisted her ankle and couldn't make it back home on her own. Meanwhile, the strangers continued to lead Carrie further and further away from the ranch. After discussing how far they needed to go, they asked her if she could walk 60 kilometers in a day. She chose not to answer, revealing her capability of running 50 kilometers in hilly terrain during training to her captors was out of the question. If they thought she was weaker than she really was, they might move at a slower pace. She had no doubt now that they wouldn't let her live. Not now, not in 4 or 5 days. They wouldn't sacrifice their precious freedom for her. Carrie continued to subtly study the men. They not only shared a common philosophy but also bore a striking resemblance to each other. She started suspecting they were father and son. Carrie knew that people would soon start looking for her, but the thought of her parents or friends falling victim to her captors was far more terrifying than anything she had experienced so far. One way to avoid this was to escape. Since pleading didn't work, she decided to change tactics. Her tennis coach used to say, "Change your tactics when you're losing." Why continue playing a losing game when you have the opportunity to change your strategy? Around 5 p.m., the men decided to take a break for the night, but not before chaining her to a tree, severely limiting her chances of a possible escape. Mosquitoes and black flies were having a feast, with Carrie as their main dish. She was exhausted, hungry, thirsty, fearful for her life, and now chained. Near the tree, she noticed several rocks, one of which could be used to break a link in the chain at night. It was time to try the new strategy. Carrie decided to become unbearable. "Hey, I'm tired of standing by the tree. Loosen the chain so I can sit down," she demanded. The men looked bewildered but allowed her to sit. With her eyes closed as if resting, she secretly tried to reach for the rock. Unfortunately, the younger man noticed her attempt and removed all the rocks she could reach. Around 8 p.m., she continued to act obnoxious and demanded feminine items as she was freezing and being driven mad by the mosquitoes. The younger man, whom the older one called Dan, gave her a shirt and socks, and the older man started talking about how they had many of his ex-wife's things in the underground caves where they live. He went on about how cozy those caves were and that they would never be found there. Carrie heard a voice in the distance. Unfortunately, her captors heard it too. Simultaneously, a plane appeared in the sky. Carrie didn't know if the plane was searching for her, but the men got alarmed and quickly extinguished the campfire. They clearly didn't expect someone to search for the captive so soon. After circling the forest for about an hour, the plane flew away. With dread, Carrie awaited the upcoming night and what they would do to her. However, they left her to herself while sitting silently by the smoldering fire. As night fell, they provided her with one sleeping bag while they lay in another. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the concern of Carrie's colleagues grew. 2 hours after she was supposed to show up for work, they started searching for her. Friends and family members of Carrie divided into 4 teams, each tasked with combing through their assigned areas. Carrie's father, Bob Swenson, got in touch with a friend who was a pilot to ask for help flying over the forest. Bob Sharp informed him about the possibility of Carrie encountering a grizzly bear on that trail, which filled him with dread. The teams searched for several hours, calling out her name as they combed the areas where Carrie was likely to run, but as darkness fell, they had to suspend the search. Carrie's brother, Paul, found their father at the ranch after he returned from the airstrip. His father looked pale and restless with worry. Paul needed some time alone, so he asked his father to let him know as soon as there was any news about Carrie and went to his room. He quickly took a shower and lay down on his bed. Suddenly, he saw Carrie. She was tied to a log like some kind of captive animal. The men were sitting around a campfire nearby. His sister was crying. Paul woke up from this horrifying nightmare, not understanding what it could mean, and hoping that it was just a bad dream. With the dawn, they would resume the search, and they would surely find her. In the morning, the captors decided to move the camp to a different location, but to Carrie's surprise, they only shifted it about 50 meters from the original campsite. Despite the ongoing search for her, Dan didn't hesitate to go hunting with his firearm, shooting a squirrel for breakfast. While Dan was preparing breakfast, the older man demanded that Carrie hand over her shorts, stating that their bright red color attracted too much attention. He took them and went back to the old campsite. This presented an opportunity for Carrie to talk to Dan alone. She tried to persuade him to let her go back to her family, telling him that he was too young for such crimes. Dan looked at her attentively, with no hint of a smile, concern, or regret on his face, and said, "No, you're cute, and you'll stay with me." Meanwhile, the second kidnapper returned and gave Carrie her shorts, stained with soot from the previous campfire. Trying to hold back tears, Carrie started putting on the shorts inside her sleeping bag. She was almost done when she heard rustling in the bushes to her right and saw a person lying flat on the ground. Dan quickly got up and drew his gun from its holster. Carrie shouted, "Stay back. Don't come any closer. They're armed and they'll shoot." "Shut her up," the older man ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Go away, they'll kill you," Carrie shouted again when suddenly a deafening sound echoed, and she was thrown backward. The searing pain pierced her chest, and she smelled the gunpowder. Dan repeated in shock, "I didn't mean to shoot her. I didn't mean to." Incredibly, Carrie thought, she had been shocked just at the moment when rescue was so close. The kidnappers made no attempt to help her, but from the bushes to the left, another person emerged. It was another ranch employee, Jim Schwalbe. Apparently, he didn't realize that the kidnappers were criminals and assumed they were part of a rescue team trying to help Carrie, possibly scaring off a bear but accidentally hitting her. Jim rushed towards Carrie, dropping his backpack on the ground. It was only then that he saw the chain around her waist under the sleeping bag and began to understand the truth. He demanded that the older man remove the chain from Carrie, while he continued to be threatened with the rifle. Dan threw his gun to the ground and took out the key to the chain. Jim then addressed one of the kidnappers, Alan Goldstein, telling him to run for help. But apparently, Alan had already figured out their true nature. He shouted that he was armed and ordered the kidnappers to surrender because they were surrounded by 200 people. At that moment, Dan violently yanked the chain, and Carrie screamed in pain. When Jim turned to look at them, the older man aimed the rifle at Alan. "No," Carrie gasped. A shot rang out, and everyone heard something fall in the grass. Jim rushed to the fallen friend, but the kidnapper had already disappeared from sight. The older man reloaded the rifle and aimed it in Jim's direction, but he was too far away by then. The kidnappers quickly packed their belongings into their backpacks, took the chain, and even dumped Carrie out of her sleeping bag, stating that she wouldn't need it anymore. They made no attempt to help Carrie or Alan, leaving them both lying on the cold ground. Carrie heard the crackling of Alan's radio but didn't dare hope to reach it as he was lying too far away. The cold penetrated her entire body, and with her last bit of strength, she attempted to crawl towards the extinguished fire. Lying on her stomach, she tossed some twigs and leaves towards the fire, hoping that there were still warm logs that could help the leaves catch fire. Carrie tried to blow on them, but she was too weak and lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt an army of black ants rushing towards her blood-soaked shirt. No, she shooed them away. These insatiable insects reminded her of her thirst for life. She needed to find the radio and help Alan, but he had fallen too far away. However, she noticed Jim's backpack nearby. Her frozen fingers refused to cooperate, but finally, she managed to unfasten the backpack and found a water bottle, a chocolate bar, and a sleeping bag inside. The radio was not there. Carrie managed to put her legs into the sleeping bag and, finding some warmth, opened the water bottle. It turned out to be warm lemonade, and she took a sip and nibbled on the chocolate bar. Carrie once again tried to get closer to Alan, but this time, she had to drag the sleeping bag along with her. She couldn't help but feel like a caterpillar crawling on the ground and imagined how her brother Paul would react to that image. He would probably laugh and cheer her on at every step. She chuckled at the silly thoughts that come to mind in such moments. About 1.5 kilometers from the shootout site, other search teams continued their efforts, unaware of what had happened. Suddenly, Jim Schwalbe interrupted them. Gasping for breath, he shouted to the people surrounding him. There were 2 guys. They tied Carrie to a log and shot her when she yelled at us to stay away. Bob asked him if she was alive. She was when I ran away, but that scoundrel shot her, and the old man got Alan in the head. With every breath, life was leaving Carrie. Breathing became incredibly difficult, exacerbating the bleeding. A decision came to her intuitively. She closed her eyes and found herself back on the biathlon track. Biathletes practice their breathing technique methodically, just like speed and accuracy. Carrie focused, and very slow breathing, almost like in yoga, allowed her to slow down her heart rate and bleeding. Annoying flies buzzed around her, but strangely, they helped her stay conscious. She thought about Jim. He should have brought help by now, unless he ran into the kidnappers again. After a few hours, that annoying buzzing sound returned. Carrie looked around in search of the source and spotted a helicopter hovering above the treetops. It paused directly over her, and people were peering out of it. "Please, find us quickly," she silently pleaded. The helicopter flew away, but suddenly she heard the cracking of branches and the sound of a radio. "Help," she cried out with all her remaining strength. "Here she is," someone shouted. "We found her." "Are you okay, Carrie? Can you hear me?" asked a man. "Yes," she replied. She wanted to shout, scream, thank them for finding her, but all she could manage was a smile. Her eyelids felt heavy as if filled with lead, and it was hard to see what was happening next. While Carrie was being taken to the hospital, the police put all their efforts into finding her kidnappers. Little did they know it would be the beginning of a months-long search. The local forests and mountains cover hundreds of kilometers, and no one knows them better than the 2 fugitives. Over the course of 5.5 months, the kidnappers managed to elude the police successfully, and the media romanticized their image, calling them mountain men from another era. They portrayed Ran as a handsome prince and the other man as stern and loving father. It even reached a point where a local businessman wanted to sell T-shirts with their images. Meanwhile, the journalists overlooked the victims of their crimes. Then, about 2 weeks before Christmas, Sheriff Johnny France received an unexpected tip-off. One of his relatives noticed smoke on his ranch property in the woods. France had grown up on that ranch and knew every inch of it. It was dark, the radio had intermittent signals in the mountains, and the criminals could disappear at any moment. Nevertheless, the sheriff rushed to their camp. "Why did I go there alone? Because that's what I was paid for," he joked years later. He arrived as quickly as he could on a snowmobile, tracked down the father and son, and had them in his sights. The father immediately pulled out his rifle and threatened to shoot. In response, the sheriff warned that 2 shots would be fired at his son. He had to use the boy as leverage to get the father to listen. The sheriff convinced them that they could finally warm up, eat properly, and take a shower, which worked. Within minutes, the situation was fully under the sheriff's control. The kidnappers, Dan Nichols and his father, Don Nichols, were arrested and charged with kidnapping. Don was also charged with the murder of Alan Goldstein. At the trial, it was revealed that the men had planned the kidnapping several years ago. Dan refused to live in the mountains without a woman, and since not every girl would agree to their way of life, about 5 to 6 years ago, Don Nichols purchased a chain for his future bride. He dreamed of founding his own clan, living away from society, and Carrie was destined to play the role of the mother to his son's future offspring. Don was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but he was released in 2017. Dan was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 6 years. It seemed that the young man had turned his life around, getting married, getting an education, and deciding to help disabled people. However, in 2012, he was arrested again in connection with illegal substances. As for Carrie, she spent 8 days in the hospital, and immediately after being discharged, she began pushing the boundaries of her own physical abilities, overcoming pain to speed up her recovery. By 1986, Carrie had recovered enough to participate in biathlon competitions in Oslo, Norway. She achieved a 4th place, but the athlete who finished 3rd invited her to stand with her on the podium, acknowledging her merits. To others, it might have seemed that she had fully recovered, but Carrie knew that the kidnapping and injury had left a lasting mark that would never disappear. She continued to experience pain from scar tissue and the bullet shrapnel still lodged in her body, affecting nearby nerves during significant physical exertion. As a result, she decided to quit competitive sports and focus on a career as a veterinarian, heading to study in Colorado. Today, Carrie Swenson works as a veterinarian in Bozeman, Montana, and continues to enjoy outdoor activities, which she has loved since her early childhood. She rarely talks about the events that happened and has become a harsh critic of the media's coverage of the kidnapping. In particular, she found the romanticizing of the kidnappers and murderers as rugged mountain men skilled in wilderness survival to be inappropriate. She also believed that the media significantly downplayed the emotional trauma of the abduction, portraying the experience as more romantic than it truly was in the hands of the mountain people. In 2012, when Dana was arrested again, Carrie wrote an article for the local newspaper, mocking the so-called mountain men. The Nicholses may have lived in the mountains at times, but they couldn't survive there, at least not without theft and robbery, often leaving the woods for months and buying modern equipment. In the end, they were so easy to catch because they froze, starved, and grew tired of mountain life. They are no true mountain men, she wrote. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă numiți.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheam Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un punct de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06. and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found, and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mashishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gerga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Georga started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Georga returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Georga say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Gheorghe Dincă was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Gheorghe confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dincă was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Luisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Luisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Luisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Luisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Luisa's grandfather, assuring him that Luisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Luisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the 4th day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Luisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Luisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Mașișanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the 2 murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Luisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Luiza's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Luiza and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the 2 murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Luiza and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louisa's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luiza refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luiza, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Georga and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Georga behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Georga might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Georga, but Alexandra's mother and Louisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Georga might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Georga's car was connected to Louisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Georga's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Georga hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Georga Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Georga had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Georga's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Georga's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Georga most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Georga was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Georga was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Gheorghe once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened.
It all started right where it ended, at St. Malachy's Church in Tyrone, Northern Ireland. In December 2010, beauty queen and teacher Michaela Hart and sports star John McCarthy tied the knot, sharing their celebration with over 300 guests. However, just 3 weeks later, John returned with the body of his young wife, who was buried in her pristine wedding gown. What led to Michaela's death? Who could be so heartless and calculated as to take the life of a woman who had just begun to enjoy married life with her beloved? And will the collaborative efforts of multiple countries help uncover one of the most memorable and harrowing crimes of recent years? The captain of the Irish football team, John McCarthy, and the daughter of one of the country's top football managers, Michaela Hart, met at university in 2005. It was love at first sight, and since then, the young couple had never been apart. During a vacation in Paris, John proposed to Michaela, and she happily accepted. They planned their wedding for New Year's Eve, on Michaela's 27th birthday. After the ceremonial wedding, the newlyweds boarded a plane, embarking on their 3-week honeymoon. They spent the first week in Dubai before the most anticipated part of their trip began, 2 weeks at the 5-star Legends Hotel, located in the fishing village of Grand Gauba on the northeast coast of Mauritius. Michaela chose Mauritius as their paradise island for the dreamy honeymoon and carefully researched local hotels. They settled on Legends Hotel due to its numerous positive reviews and popularity among tourists from Ireland. Upon arrival at the hotel, they asked the receptionist if they could be allocated one of their best rooms. They were informed that there was a vacant room in the luxury block, room 1025. January 10, 2011, after having breakfast together, John decided to play golf while Michaela sunbathed. They met again for lunch. Michaela always enjoyed having tea with something delicious after lunch. She asked her husband to order tea while she went to the room to get Kit Kat bars with her favorite dark chocolate, which she had brought from Dubai and kept in the refrigerator. John offered to bring the treats for her, but it was only 150 steps from the restaurant to the room, so she went by herself. John took some photos and watched videos while waiting for his wife to return. After some time, he began to wonder why Michaela hadn't come back yet. He decided to look for her. Knocking on the door, John received no response. Since he had forgotten his key in the room, he peeked through the window but couldn't see anything, so he went to the receptionist. The corridor attendant led him back to the room and opened the door with his key. However, as soon as the corridor attendant took a few steps away from the door, he heard the cries of a man asking for immediate help. Upon entering the room, John discovered his wife in the bathtub filled with cold water. Bruises were visible on her neck, her skin was icy to the touch, and her lips had turned blue. Assuming that Michaela had intended to take a bath due to back pain but slipped or lost consciousness, John attempted to help her. However, his efforts were in vain. Within an hour, medical professionals pronounced Michaela's death, bringing an end to the dreams of a young and happy married couple. Presumably, due to the initial assumption of an unfortunate accident, nobody attempted to secure the crime scene, and people constantly entered and exited the newlyweds' room. The police were initially informed that a tourist had drowned, but upon entering the room and observing the state of Michaela's body and the disorder in the room, they suspected a murder had taken place. The distraught husband was taken to the police station and held for questioning for 5 hours. This was not unusual since most murders are committed by individuals close to the victims. What was abnormal in John's case was the cruelty and inappropriateness of the statements made by the police officers. Naturally, John couldn't hide his tears over the loss of Michaela. Just half an hour earlier, he had seen his wife happily walking towards their room, but now he discovered her lifeless body in the bathtub. However, upon seeing his tears, a police officer, perhaps trying to console him, said, "Why are you crying? You're still young. You'll find yourself a new wife." It is unknown how long they would have kept John at the station if it hadn't been for the hotel manager's intervention. The manager informed the police that the door of room 1025 had been opened with a stolen master key that fit all the locks. It became evident that the murder had been committed by someone from the hotel staff. It was likely an unintentional murder. Someone among the staff, possibly a security guard with access to the master key, entered the room at 2:42 p.m. 2 minutes later, Michaela opened her own door. The thief, possibly hiding in a small niche in the bathroom, had to quickly consider his options due to the unexpected presence of the maid. If his duties involved room cleaning, he could have simply smiled at Michaela, pretended to do his job, and nothing would have happened because it's a common situation in a hotel. However, if he was a security guard, he knew that his presence in the room would not be easily explainable. So, the only option he saw for himself was to hide in the bathroom and hope that the woman would simply leave. But that didn't happen. As investigators speculated, Michaela decided to take advantage of the opportunity and entered the bathroom. Inside, she encountered the thief. Michaela got scared and ran, and the thief, in panic, attacked her. Realizing that he had killed Michaela, he placed her in the bathtub. Perhaps he tried to create the appearance of an accidental incident with the maid. Despite the shock, he may have also thought that water would wash away any DNA evidence left on his victim. When John got up from the table at 3:05 p.m. and went to check why his wife was taking so long, the killer was still in the room. If John had his keycard with him, he could have caught the killer at the scene of the crime. However, by the time he went to the administrator, asked for the door to be opened, and entered the room, it was already 3:26 p.m., and the thief, unintentionally turned murderer, had vanished. Releasing John put the police under immense pressure. When a tourist is killed in a country that heavily relies on tourism, it becomes crucial to quickly solve the case. It seemed like the case would be solved promptly because the local police chief stated that the island had a 100% homicide clearance rate. One might think he was just acknowledging the efforts of his subordinates, but any professional would be suspicious considering that in 2011, besides Michaela, 30 other people were killed on the island, and all cases, except Michaela's, were solved based on confessions from suspects. The following year, the police once again solved all cases based on confessions. The fact that the police excessively relied on instinct and intuition, if it can be called that, could have been compensated by the fact that the investigators had an ideal crime scene. The hotel room was clean every day. Each entry into the room was recorded by the security system. Surveillance cameras were placed everywhere, and the hotel itself was practically an impregnable fortress, with vigilant security guards everywhere. As it will become clear shortly, that was not the case at all. Within 2 days of the murder, the police arrested several hotel employees, and 2 of them, Avinash Tribhuwan and Sandeep Mania, were charged with the murder while the others reluctantly became key prosecution witnesses. A week later, a hotel security guard named Dasan Narayanan was also arrested. Dasan was on duty on the day of the murder. His exact location at the time of the crime could not be confirmed, but his fingerprints were found on a fake key that the thieves used to replace the stolen universal key in the security room. Dasan couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for how his DNA ended up on the safe door in the room. He admitted to touching Michaela's cheek when he rushed to help John, offering an explanation in advance for how his DNA could be present if it was found. However, despite Dasan's conflicting statements, the police decided to charge him only with being an accomplice to the thefts, focusing their main efforts on Avinash and Sandeep. On May 22, 2012,
the trial began. The prosecution built its case primarily on the confession obtained by the police, following their customary practice. Prosecutors argued that when Michaela returned to the room on that day, she caught Avinash and Sandeep stealing money from the safe or her purse. Since hotel employees are often the main breadwinners for their families, not just immediate relatives, the thieves preferred to silence Michaela to avoid losing their jobs. During the trial, their colleague Raj Thikoy also testified. He was initially arrested but became the key prosecution witness and received immunity. Raj stated that he was near the room and heard the agonized cries of a woman but didn't knock on the door. Instead, he hid and saw the agitated and sweaty Avinash and Sandeep leave the newlyweds' room. Later, he asked what had happened, and they replied, "Nothing happened, just keep quiet. If you say anything, we'll involve you in this matter." In addition to witness testimonies, the prosecutors largely relied on the confession obtained from one of the suspects, Avinash Tripuwoon, following the customary police practices. Despite the fact that Sandeep and Avinash were the accused, it created an impression that the police themselves were being judged alongside them as they conducted a careless investigation. The defense attorneys drew attention to all the evident gaps, inaccuracies, and blatant errors made by the investigators. Firstly, after the discovery of Michaela's body, the hotel was not sealed off, and not a single guest or staff member was interviewed. Some tests were not conducted, while others were only performed after the hotel room was returned to the hotel's control, compromising the evidence. Fingerprints and palm prints were found in the room, but their owners were not identified. However, no DNA evidence indicating the guilt of Sandeep and Avinash was found. Even the paper currency, which according to the prosecutors interested the thieves, was not fingerprinted or examined for DNA. The court also heard that all the crime scene photographs were taken in black and white, and many important items were not photographed at all. But the biggest uproar was caused by the mystery of the 46 surveillance cameras capturing the events inside and around the hotel. Despite numerous requests, the police did not hand over the video recordings to the defense attorneys. It turned out that they did not withhold the footage because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. 90% of the videos were erased by the police officers who were unable to operate the cameras. When asked to demonstrate how the equipment works, instead of honestly answering yes, they simply pressed the button. It happened to be the record button, and when they thought they were playing back the recordings, they were actually erasing them. The glaring incompetence of the police made international media wonder if the local authorities were deliberately sabotaging the investigation. Finally, the accused claimed that they only made confessions after being subjected to torture by the police. Dasan Narayanan, who allegedly gave Sandeep the key card, claimed that he was forced to make the confession under threat of a weapon. Avinash also denied his statements, stating that the police tortured him and interrogated him with water, after which he vomited blood. Furthermore, he was allegedly told that his wife would be deported and he would be forced to live in Ireland with John McCrime, who would now need a new spouse. Avinash stated that he didn't even read his own confession because he simply signed the document that was presented to him. Another witness stated that he was forced to give false testimony, even though he and Sandeep were actually in room 1009 at the time of the murder, where a VIP client was supposed to stay, and Sandeep insisted on his subordinate maintaining perfect cleanliness in the room. At one point, he even grabbed the mop himself and demonstrated how the floors should be cleaned. Additionally, Sandeep claimed that he was on the phone with his sister in Britain at the time of the crime, which was corroborated by telecommunications data. Finally, the preserved surveillance camera footage also confirmed that he was in a different part of the hotel at the time of the murder. Overall, the court proceedings, which were expected to last for 2 weeks, dragged on for almost 8 weeks. This was largely due to the defense attorneys crossing the boundaries of decorum and turning the trial into a show. They constantly made jokes and elicited bursts of laughter among the bored onlookers and law students present in the courtroom. The defense raised the issue of there potentially being a sexual motive for the crime, hinting at the involvement of Michaela's husband. They referred to an intimate aid they found in the hotel room and insinuated possible misconduct between John and his wife. However, it turned out to be a simple insert from a women's magazine, Cosmopolitan, which Michaela had purchased at the airport. They then attempted to prove that John and Michaela had a severe argument, presenting a video that allegedly confirmed this. However, the individuals in the video were not Michaela and John, but rather two people resembling them from Germany. As a result, John had to contact this man on Facebook and request him to provide a statement at a police station in Germany, confirming that he was the one in the video. Overall, Michaela's family was incredibly distressed by the sensationalism surrounding the case of her murder. In particular, a local newspaper conducted a survey titled "Who Killed Michaela?" and John ended up ranking high on the list of the readers' votes. Additionally, the Mauritian newspaper published by the police the photos of Michaela's naked and bruised body, causing indescribable anguish to her family. Nevertheless, these 8 weeks came to an end, and it was time for the jury members to make their decision. The judge summarized the case, clearly pointing out the guilt of the suspects, leading Michaela's family to believe that it would give the accused the right to demand a review of the case after a guilty verdict. They had no doubt that the verdict would be exactly as they anticipated. Furthermore, the judge strongly advised the jury not to consider the impact this case would have on the country's image, but to make the right decision from their perspective. And after 2 months of trial, deliberating for only 2 hours, the jury declared Avinash and Sandeep innocent. After the acquittal verdict, John and Michaela's families were incredibly disappointed. They endured all the agony of the process, inappropriate remarks from attorneys and police, tolerated laughter in the courtroom, and even faced aggressive behavior from the locals because they were confident that the guilty parties would be punished for the murder. They were certain of Avinash and Sandeep's guilt and believed that they were acquitted because the case received global media attention, and the jurors did not want the murder case to reflect negatively on Mauritius' image. The Hart and McCavery families cannot forget that Avinash's lawyer appeared on a local radio station and essentially admitted his client's guilt, mentioning how Avinash cried and apologized to Michaela's family. The interview was supposed to be presented in court, but the lawyer managed to evade his responsibilities. John believes that Avinash told the truth when he confessed to Michaela's murder, and here's why. When anyone hears about death by strangulation, they imagine the killer choking the victim, gripping their neck with 2 hands. But Avinash recounted that when they were in the honeymoon suite, Michaela walked in and saw him holding a wallet. She asked what he was doing. She couldn't have known that Sandeep was in the bathroom. When the girl tried to prevent Avinash from leaving the room, standing in his way, Sandeep approached her from behind and wrapped one hand around her neck. The thing is, the autopsy report was compiled much later, and it confirmed that everything happened exactly as Avinash described. How could Avinash have invented such a method of strangulation if he didn't know it for sure? Additionally, Avinash mentioned that Michaela hit her head on the floor when she fell. The bruise on the back of her head, found during the autopsy, confirmed that as well. Furthermore, in summarizing the case, the judge reminded everyone that Avinash made his confession on January 12th and signed it on the 13th in the presence of his lawyer. If the police wanted to fabricate the confession, they would have forced Avinash to sign something else on the 12th. Moreover, the boy was examined by 3 doctors on different days, and none of them found any signs of torture on him. After the acquittal verdict, a new investigation was initiated. The police focused on a crucial piece of evidence, the keycard that the thief and murderer used to enter the room. However, even the mechanism of these locks cannot be trusted. The locks are not synchronized, and each of the 240 locks in the Legends Hotel shows its own time on the security systems panel, making it impossible to determine the exact time when the killer entered Michaela's room. As a result, the alibi of practically any suspect is in question because the exact time of the crime is unknown. To make matters worse, another significant loophole was found in the hotel's guest security. This loophole could increase the number of potential suspects from dozens to hundreds. If the hotel owns the guest rooms, restaurants, bars, golf courses and similar areas, the beach is considered public property. According to Mauritian law, the island's beaches belong to the local residents, and fishermen and traders have always had full access to both the beach and the hotel's premises. Local traders sell their crafts to tourists, and young boys are accustomed to spending time on the hotel's grounds. In other words, despite the cameras, gates, and security personnel, the hotel is unable to provide complete protection of its premises, and there is no way to verify who had access to the honeymoon suite. As a result, the new investigation into the case also ended up with no significant breakthroughs. Under international pressure, the Mauritian police revisited Michaela's murder multiple times and even enlisted the services of a French laboratory for retesting DNA samples. In 2014, there was information about a breakthrough in the case when DNA found on Michaela's clothing matched the DNA of one of the suspects. However, this discovery was insufficient to warrant a new trial. In 2017, in an attempt to draw attention back to the case, John announced a substantial reward for information about the case. A few weeks after his return home, he received a call from a lawyer informing him that the arrests of Sandeep and Avinash were now inevitable. The lawyer did not specify the new evidence that made this possible, but Michaela's family felt relieved and believed that they would finally achieve justice. However, weeks and months passed, and no one was arrested. The case was officially closed in 2020, but in 2021, under pressure from Irish politicians, the Mauritian government agreed to reopen the case. The problem lies in the fact that the willingness to re-examine the case does not guarantee that it will be solved. Investigating any murder after 10 years is challenging, let alone considering the possibility that officials in Mauritius may lack the desire to find the killers. Over the course of 10 years, many investigators have climbed the career ladder, and if something is revealed in the case that many would prefer to bury, heads will roll. After the trial, John and Michaela's family filed a lawsuit against the hotel for €1.6 million. They settled the case out of court, and the details of the agreement are not disclosed, but the money went to a foundation established in Michaela's honor. Legends Hotel was renamed Lux Hotel and continues to enjoy immense popularity, as does Room 1025, which underwent renovations and was assigned the new number 1026. John, who now works as an accountant, met a pleasant girl named Cara Brennan at a memorial dinner for Michaela in 2013. Tara, also an accountant, received a marriage proposal from John in 2015. Last year, the couple welcomed their first child, James McCavery. On May 13, 2015, around 5 p.m., firefighters extinguished a raging fire in a garage by the roadside in the village of Sand Lake, Michigan. At that moment, a frightened woman ran up to their vehicle, shouting that her neighbors were dead. Several firefighters hurried with the woman to her neighbor's house. In the bedroom, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, were two lifeless bodies. It appeared that they had been shot. To preserve the evidence at the crime scene, the firefighters refrained from touching anything and immediately informed the police that they had found two bodies and required investigators and forensic experts. Forensic experts had been working at the crime scene for about an hour, collecting evidence and photographing the bodies of 46-year-old Martin Durham and 47-year-old Glenna Durham when one officer noticed a slight movement in Glenna's chest. Just a tiny bit. He rushed to her body and tried to feel for a pulse. But before he could touch her, Glenna's eyes opened wide, and she sat up abruptly, screaming, "What are you doing, Marty?" The officer immediately called for paramedics, who transported the injured woman to the local hospital. Marty and Glenna first met as teenagers in the early 1980s. Marty invited the girl on a date to a local open-air theater, where they lost their virginity on the very same evening, with little interest in the movie itself. Their relationship progressed quickly and passionately, but they broke up after a few months, partly because 17-year-old Glenna was married. Soon Marty started a family of his own. Christina Keller was 14 years old when she met 19-year-old Marty at a party held at his house. The young man seemed charming and fun to the girl, but also a little strange because he immediately declared that he would marry her someday. The next day, Marty showed up at her doorstep. Apparently, he made a favorable impression on Christina's parents because after that, he never left her life. Their friendship developed into a romantic relationship, and soon 16-year-old Christina discovered that she was expecting their first child. Within 2 years, she was carrying their second son, which prompted the young couple to get married. 11 months later, Christina gave her husband a daughter. Christina was 19 and Marty was 24 at the time. Initially, the young family lived with relatives, but in early 1995, Marty obtained a higher-paying job at a factory in Michigan, and the family of 5 moved there. However, on the evening of February 16, 1995, while returning from work, Marty was involved in a car accident. Another vehicle, speeding through a red light, collided with his car. The larger vehicle practically crushed Marty's car, trapping him inside. Marty was taken to the hospital, where he was in a clinically dead state for about 5 minutes. The left side of his body suffered severe injuries, and he remained in a coma for over 3 weeks. When he finally regained consciousness, he had no recollection of his wife, children, or much of his past life. He spent a year and a half learning to walk, speak, eat, and take care of himself again. Throughout this time, Christina supported him. Physically, Marty increasingly resembled his former self, but psychologically, he had changed. Due to the brain trauma, he experienced bouts of rage. He never raised his hand against his wife and children but became a domineering person. Even his sense of humor became darker. In 2000, almost 5 years after the accident, Christina filed for divorce. She still cared deeply for her husband, but her feelings had transformed into more of a maternal nature, as she took on the role of his caregiver and could no longer relate to him in any other way. In May 2001, Marty purchased his first home using the funds he received from the insurance company, along with a bank loan. The house was located in the small village of Sand Lake, Michigan, where only 500 people reside. Marty was incredibly proud of his new home, where he moved in with his 2 sons and an African gray parrot named Bud. 2 months after moving into the house, Marty was surprised by a knock on his door from a 16-year-old girl who claimed to be his daughter. Marty asked who her mother was, and it turned out to be Glenna, his first love. The girl knew that her mother had had an affair early in her marriage, and she was born a few months later. She wanted to establish her paternity for certain. A DNA test confirmed that the girl was indeed Marty's biological daughter, born out of wedlock. This revelation led to the rekindling of Marty and Glenna's relationship, despite Glenna still being married. Clearly, Glenna had never been able to forget Marty, as she had a tattoo with his name on her arm throughout her marriage. Glenna divorced her husband and moved in with Marty. They were very happy together and soon had a new wedding ceremony. Glenna's new husband meant everything to her. The couple spent all their time together, visiting family, and going to the local casino once or twice a week. Even when Marty went hunting, Glenna would sit in the car and read a novel. Officially taking on the responsibility of caring for her husband, Glenna received $3,200 per month for her services. Marty's disability benefits amounted to over $1,000 per month. Additionally, Glenna sold excess medication from Marty, so their monthly income was approximately $5,000. When Marty's sons moved out, this income was sufficient for their life in the small village. However, by 2010, Marty's health, both mental and physical, had deteriorated significantly. The couple continued to spend all their time together and with their friends, including Connie and Keith Ream, another neighboring couple. On Monday, May 11, 2015, Marty offered to mow the lawn in Connie and Keith's backyard. He enjoyed doing this work and did it completely free of charge. Later that evening, all 4 of them, Connie, Keith, Marty, and Glenna sat on the neighbor's terrace, and the Durhams returned home around 9 p.m. The next day, on Tuesday, at 8:26 a.m., Keith sent Marty a message asking how he was feeling, but he didn't receive a response. This was strange because Marty always promptly answered calls and messages. Throughout the day, Keith sent several more messages to his friend with the same result. Later that day, Connie approached the neighbor's door and knocked. She heard the Shelby family's dog barking, but no one opened the door. Keith even sent a joking message to Glenna saying, "What did you do to Marty?" Of course, she didn't respond to him either. On Wednesday, at 7:30 a.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house again and rang the doorbell. The only response she received was the dog barking. She walked around the house, checking if any doors or windows were open. Everything was locked as usual. Throughout the day, Connie and Keith tried to contact their neighbors, becoming increasingly worried. After work, around 4:30 p.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house for the third time and knocked. She was sure she would have to break the door, but to her surprise, when she touched the handle, she discovered that the door was not locked this time. Connie cautiously opened the door and called out for the neighbors. But at the door, she was only met by the Shelby family pet, who led her into the living room where there was a gruesome mess. Documents and photographs were scattered everywhere, a broken lamp and other items were in disarray. Following Shelby into the bedroom, Connie found the homeowners lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Marty was only in his underwear, while Glenna was fully dressed, with her legs covered by a blanket. Connie rushed out of the neighbor's house and ran towards a fire truck she noticed further down the road. Marty was not as lucky as his wife. 5 bullets that hit his back, forearm, and chest left him no chance of survival. He had been dead for several days. Glenna was shot twice, with both shots hitting the area behind her right ear. Blood was found not only in the bedroom, but also on the chair in the living room and on a pillow with 2 bullet holes. Underneath the chair, a gun and 2 empty shells were found. In the bedroom, there were 5 more shell casings, 1 near the door and 4 near Marty's body, totaling 7 in total. However, the gun found near the chair was designed for 6 bullets. This means that the perpetrator found time to reload the gun before continuing the shooting. Apart from the living room and bedroom, the rooms in the house appeared completely normal. There were no signs of forced entry, and in the kitchen, there was a bowl of spaghetti and a piece of garlic bread on the table. Later that same evening, when Glenna was taken to the hospital, Marty's children were allowed to take the family pets, a dog and a parrot, and bring them to their mother's house, Christina. Although the children were only permitted to take the pets, the trio did not miss the opportunity to search the house and discovered a sealed envelope with the word personal written on it. Inside, they found letters from Glenna addressed to her children and ex-husband. In the letters, she expressed her love for the children and asked for their forgiveness for not being the best mother. She also asked her ex-husband to take care of the children. Additionally, in Glenna's drawer, they found a packet of unpaid bills. They handed over all the findings to the police. The investigators began questioning the family's relatives and friends about their relationships and financial situation. They loved spending time together and were truly absorbed in each other's company. However, it soon became clear that they were facing serious financial difficulties. Glenna was in charge of the family's accounts, and relatives believed that Marty was unaware of the severity of their situation because he was quite frugal. On the other hand, Glenna had developed a serious addiction to gambling. She would spend hundreds of dollars on lottery tickets and lose thousands of dollars at the casino. But whenever her husband approached her, she would pretend to be playing with $1 bills. She played every week, and in 2010 alone, Glenna spent $75,000 on her addiction. The family had fallen behind on tax payments, had credit card debt, and Marty's car was on the verge of being repossessed. However, the most pressing issue was their home. Glenna hadn't made mortgage payments for over a year, and they had accumulated a debt of $48,000. In early April 2015, a few weeks before the attack on the family, Marty's mother saw a list of homes that would be seized due to debts, and Marty's address was listed there. She called Glenna, who assured her that the newspaper had printed the wrong address and that she would sort it out. Of course, it turned out that their home was indeed being taken away. Despite the fact that Marty had taken out the mortgage, on April 28th, Glenna received a notice that their home would be auctioned if they didn't pay $5,000. Interestingly, the auction was scheduled for May 12th, just a day before Marty and Glenna were found by their neighbor. The investigators concluded that Marty was unaware of the impending loss of their home because he had been renovating it for the past 2 months. Just 2 days before their deaths, he had painted the bathroom. After 3 days in the intensive care unit, Glenna regained consciousness. She had no recollection of the day of the murders or the preceding days. She couldn't even remember writing the letters to her children and ex-husband. Since the eyewitness couldn't provide any helpful information, the police had few leads or clues to work with. The weapon contained multiple DNA samples, as Marty was an avid hunter and often showed his firearms to friends. However, Glenna and Marty also sold drugs, for which they received cash payments, and large sums of money were stored in envelopes in a safe. Could this have been an unplanned robbery? The living room was in disarray, as if someone had been searching for something, and the cash from the safe was indeed missing. This version of events seemed the most plausible, but finding the killer among the clients of their illegal activities was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A whole year passed before an unexpected witness helped solve the case. It was a 19-year-old parrot named Bud, who had been living with Christina for the past 12 months. Bud was an African grey parrot and had the unique ability of not only mimicking sounds and words he heard in his environment but also imitating human voices. Originally, he was Christina's beloved pet, but Marty took him, presumably as a way to get back at his ex-wife for leaving him. Upon returning to his beloved owner, Bud started reproducing various conversations he had heard while living with Marty, such as how Marty played with the dog. But at some point, he began repeating an argument between a man and a woman. They were clearly arguing with each other, raising their voices and occasionally mixing profanity with regular words. And at the end of the dialogue, a male voice shouted clearly, "No, no, don't shoot." Christina recorded this scene performed by the parrot on video but didn't report it to the police, thinking it would be laughed off. However, when a local journalist interviewed Marty's mother a year after his murder, she mentioned the video. The journalist became very interested and aired it on the news. The video quickly went viral, and the increased public attention forced the police to reopen the case and focus their attention on one suspect, Glenna Durham. They examined Marty and Glenna's phones and discovered that the last thing Marty did on his phone was search for information about lawnmowers on the evening of the 11th, after they returned home from the neighbors. The examination of Glenna's phone turned out to be much more intriguing. It had been used until the 13th, the day the bodies were found. From 3:32 a.m. to 4:48 a.m., someone used the phone 5 times to find information about the gun used in the shootings, including how to reload it. The last message was sent to Glenna's mother at 4:48 a.m. and said, "I love you, forgive me." Glenna was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She insisted on her innocence, and her lawyer tried to prove that another family member or a stranger had broken into the house to steal medication, cash, or Marty's weapons. However, The forensic experts did not find any signs of forced entry into the house. And what about the money from the safe? It turned out that Marty's children had taken it while they were searching the house when Glenna was taken to the hospital and their father to the morgue. When investigators accidentally learned about this, they stated that nobody had asked them about the money at the police station, so they didn't say anything. In any case, the version of a robber was discarded because nothing was stolen. The prosecution's version of events painted a much more plausible picture. Here's what they believed happened. Since Marty was in his underwear, he could have been killed on the morning of the 12th. The man must have learned about the inevitable loss of the house, became very upset, and a heated argument ensued. When Glenna grabbed the weapon, Marty turned and tried to run into the bedroom. She shot him in the back. Marty was still on his feet, reaching for another weapon in the bedside table. Glenna fired again, hitting his forearm. Only then did he turn to face her, and she sent 3 more bullets into his chest. Marty fell lifeless on the bedroom floor. Glenna spent the whole day doing paperwork. She wrote letters to her ex-husband and children and prepared spaghetti for lunch. When the neighbor showed up at her house for the first time on the evening of the 12th, Glenna was still engaged in these activities. Understanding that the neighbors would start to worry about her and Marty, no matter what Glenna planned, she needed to act quickly. She settled into a chair in the living room, placed a pillow against her head, and fired. However, nothing happened. The pillow absorbed the force of the shot, and the bullet barely grazed her. Since it was the last bullet in the pistol, she had to look up online how to reload it. This means she did not attempt it again until the early morning of the 13th when she sent a message to her mother. Perhaps she still had doubts when Connie knocked on the door again at 7:30 a.m. because the door was still locked. But when Connie left, Glenna must have unlocked the door, sat in the chair, took the pillow, and tried again. This time the injury turned out to be more serious, but as her doctor later explained, she did not hit any important veins, arteries, or penetrate the skull. It's hard to imagine what state she was in, but since head wounds always bleed profusely, she may have decided that she would simply bleed out. She made her way to the bedroom, where her husband's body had been lying all this time, and collapsed on the floor, covering her legs with a blanket. Whether she staged the scene when the police officer touched her or only regained consciousness at that moment is unknown. And we may never know because Glenna continues to claim memory loss. The jury believed the prosecution's version. On Wednesday, July 19, 2017, after 9 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty of murder. Glenna Durham was sentenced to life imprisonment. Of course, the parrot named Badder was not invited to court as a witness. And it's not because he swears terribly. It's simply impossible to prove that he didn't hear that particular dialogue on a TV show or the radio, not to mention how he could take an oath in the witness stand. In other words, if Badder had participated in the process and less than 24 hours had passed since Glenna's guilty verdict, her lawyer would have filed an appeal.